The decks that were made to be played. Hey everyone, I'm Jesse from the Janjo Zone, and in this Yu-Gi-Oh! History video, we will be talking about the history of pre-constructed Yu-Gi-Oh! Starter decks and structure decks in the TCG. When it comes to decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, they've been around since the first month of the game's existence in the West. While any player could buy a bunch of booster packs and make a 40 to 60 card deck with whatever they chose or what they had, it didn't stop Konami from creating pre-made decks that the consumer could purchase, which featured a fully playable deck. These decks typically featured a range of bad cards to actually really decent ones. They also included a rule book and even sometimes a paper game mat. It became a great way to pick up and start learning the card game, playing the card game, and pivoting your creativity to upgrade the deck to your own desire as you inevitably acquired more cards to play with. So let's look at some of the early starter and structure decks and what they did right and what they did wrong. I've already covered more or less the first two starter decks in my Yugi Kaiba format video. The format was named after the two starter decks based around the two main characters in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, Yugimoto and Seto Kaiba. This first set at the end of March 2002 featured many great cards at the time, like Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, Law Jin, and Battle Ox. Many cards from the set would help define early Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta and give players useful cards that either were not available or hard to pull from the only available set at the time, Legend of Blue Eyes. Of course, you also had plenty of bad cards like Ansatsu and Shrek. Although the purpose of this was to give new players something to start with, unlike its OCG counterpart in the EX starter box that came out much later than when the game first started, which was primarily important for including many needed reprints like Dark Hole. Many of the stable cards would remain relevant throughout their competitive legality, while other cards like Battle Ox would get replaced by cards from incoming sets, like in Metal Raiders with Dark Elf, Jirai Gumo, or 7-colored Fish. But the exclusive spells like Change of Heart and Soul Exchange would become notable cards for quite some time. The next two decks that would come out would be just about a year later in March 30th, 2003, with more anime character-themed decks in Joey and Pegasus starter decks. Following their premier counterparts, these decks too would feature cards ranging from bad to good. In the Pegasus deck, we would be gifted with Relinquished, Graceful, Charity, Witch of the Black Forest, and Mystical Space Typhoon. On Joey's side of things, we would get Penguin Soldier, Polymerization, Scapegoat, Sangan, and Giant Trunade. While not all these cards would be exclusive to the decks, having the availability to pick up these cards in a single $10 deck was an easy decision. Two exclusive being Graceful Charity and Scapegoat would be very important cards to the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s metagame. Of course, if you wanted to pick these decks up for Toon cards or Red Eyes Black Dragon, then they have a use for that too. As to why they gave one of the hollow slots in Pegasus' deck to Griffin Wing, I'll never know, considering that the card it counters, Harpy's Feather Duster, wasn't even in the TCG till a few months later. We could have had a hollow for Toon Blue Eyes or Toon World. March decks seem to be the yearly thing for TCG Yu-Gi-Oh! As in March 1st, 2004, the Yugi and Kaiba Reloaded starter decks came out. These two decks kept with the familiar character thematic, just with cards that reflected the updated game state. They both featured more cards geared towards the popular Battle City arc, much like how the original decks was focused on the then ongoing Duelist Kingdom story arc. Yugi's deck would feature an alternate art Dark Magician, Blackluster Soldier, the ritual variant, and Pot of Greed. Kaiba's Reloaded deck did not include Obelisk the Tormentor, no Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. However, it would feature Kaiser Seahorse? Why? They had to make any random card from that set a hollow, why not the Diamond Dragon Hyozan Ryu? Otherwise, the deck would include cards like Jar of Greed, Tribute to the Doomed, Nobleman of Crossout, and Premature Burial. Yeah, the TCG character decks were not as stacked as the OCG decks, which featured stronger cards like Valkyrion and Thousand Eyes Restrict. I'll discuss these OCG decks in a separate non-history video. After these starter decks from 2002 to 2004, the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was already shaped to a concrete card game. So by 2005, the TCG was ready to move from the next step in structure decks. Decks more geared for specific strategies, seeing as the game moved past anime connections. But these wouldn't be TCG exclusives, as they would be worldwide decks, meaning they were available, well, worldwide. Released in Japan on December 9, 2004 and January 1, 2005 in North America, we have Zombie Madness and Dragon's Roar. Considered deck number 1, Dragon's Roar would feature a variety of ferocious dragon monsters featuring Red Eyes Darkness Dragon and Armed Dragon level 5. Since GX was the anime at the time, the deck had cards based off Chaz Princeton, Night Shroud, and Atticus, though the deck stood on its own merits. There are plenty of power cards in here like Heavy Storm, Snatch Seal, Call of the Haunted, Knock, MST, Premature Burial, and Pot of Greed. What a lineup. There was also Black Dragon's Chick, who was incorrectly translated as Red Eyes Bee Chick, an infamous mistranslation, much like Sky Scout being Harpy's brother. On the other side was Zombie Madness that had ravaging zombies, featuring Vampire Genesis and Vampire Lord. Power cards here are Giant Trunade, Torrential Tribute, Card of Safe Return, Compulse, among many other cards from Dragon's Roar. While Vampire Genesis was, well, flat out bad, many cards from this set would be staples in zombie decks for years to come, like Vampire Lord, Spirit Reaper, Book of Life, Ryukoki, and Pyramid Turtle. These support cards alone made Zombie Madness the superior deck of the two. There was also a deluxe box release that had both decks, one booster pack, and two secret rares for the decks in Rope of Life and Armed Dragon level 7. Later that year in May, there would be two more thematic structure decks in Blazing Destruction and Fury from the Deep, based on fire and water respectively. Leave your opponent standing in a cloud of smoke with fire monsters. Infernal Flame Emperor is much like Vampire Genesis, in which he's pretty bad. Although the burn strategy would be a fun playstyle. Burn cards and sun cards like Solar Flare Dragon and Level Limit Area B would be a way to go about it. Or perhaps you could consider using Thestalos, Blazing Apache, and Molten Destruction for an explosive beatdown style. If that wasn't your cup of tea, then control the waves and crush your opponent with Fury from the Deep and its powerful water monsters. Neo Daedalus, Normal Daedalus, Gravity Bind, and Tribe Infecting Virus were some powerful cards here. Using the Daedalus' effects to destroy a legendary ocean to destroy all cards on the field was a crazy effect that I most certainly remember playing against and being crushed. Both these decks had similar power spells and traps like its January predecessors, and like them, they had a special set with both decks. However, the only secret rare would be Vorse Raider? Why? When it came to getting into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, pre-made decks are a very important aspect of it. Whether it's new players wanting to quickly pick up and play, or seasoned players wanting to pick up new cards or reprints. In the TCG, we would see a variety of decks for many years, from character-themed decks to archetypal decks like Invincible Fortress, Samurai Warlords, Soul Burner, to even the more recently Obelisk and Slifer decks. My first ever deck I owned was the Yugi starter deck way back in 2002. I would continue to pick up decks for years to come because they were fun for either picking up good cards or whatever the TCG allowed us to have compared to the OCG, evenly matched I'm looking at you, like Emperor of Darkness, or just an enjoyable gimmick deck like Spellcaster's Judgment. Speed Duels made great use of character-themed decks too. It's a cool, nostalgic, and constantly evolving aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! One day, we'll get the Janjo starter deck. One day.